Welcome to this Winemakers Research Exchange virtual sensory session titled Building a Bigger White, Strategies for Crafting Structured, Layered, and Age-Worthy White Wines. My name is Joy Ting, and I'm the Research Enologist for the Winemakers Research Exchange, and I'm joined today by Melanie Natoli from Cana Vineyards. Welcome, Melanie. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your experiment with us.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can see some of the important information about the experiment. If you do want kind of to have your own version of this, Rebecca is going to drop a copy of the draft report into the chat. So if you'd like to have kind of an up close and personal version, you can find that there. And here we go with screen share. Okay. So this particular experiment was looking at long lees aging in Albariño. So Melanie, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to do this experiment.
Yeah, so I had, I've been working with the same Albariño vineyard for about 10 years, which is really great. And I have the opportunity to have a little bit more volume in some years to deal with, so I can kind of branch off and try a little something different with some of it, which is great that it allows me to do that. There was a very specific inspiration for this experiment, though. It was a bottle from Rio Spices from Gran Baizon called Don Alvaro de Gran Baizon, and you know, it was a targeted marketing email, honestly, that just kept getting thrown at me. I think I picked up the bottle from Wine Access, which I purchased some wine online before, and I've purchased other Albariños, and they keep saying, well, this one is the best. Here's why. You really need to buy this. You really want this one. You really want this. And it was pricier than the others, so I didn't go there for a while. And then eventually I was like, you know what? Let's see what this is all about. I really am interested, and I want to try it. So I purchased it and I tasted it and I really liked it. So I decided to find out, you know, what was it about that? What was different? Why was that special? So this is a producer. I think they have about 5, maybe 6 different Albariños. So they have lots of different ones in their portfolio and different things they do. And when I looked into this one, it's one that they don't do every year. They do it on good years, or great years. And the real big difference here is after the skin contact time, and we'll talk about that because that's something that scares me and I didn't go there. The big difference is there's a long lees aging time, and it's all in stainless. So it's not a barrel kind of thing, you know, like I might, you know, a Chardonnay on lees and barrel is something that's normal and fine for me. And the idea of putting Albariño in barrel, I don't love. I feel like I'm definitely gonna lose something there. They do have a bottle that they put in barrel for a bit of time too. And I have tasted one from another producer that was longer aged in barrel, and I actually didn't prefer it. So I said, well, okay, let's look at this one. And it's 2 years, which is not as far as I went. But there's just a little bit more depth and a little bit more texture that I'm attributing to the lees aging. So I wanted to see, would that be the same for us? What would happen?
Great. Yeah, so this particular producer, when you sent me the link, it's great because they put a lot of technical information right on their website. So their tech sheets are nice enough that we can kind of start to reverse engineer a little bit about what was going on here. So so as you mentioned, there was sort of 2 things about this particular version. So when I looked just yesterday, it looks like they're currently listing 8 different Albariños on the site. One of them is sparkling, and one of them is like a full orange wine. So kind of, you know, but the one that made this stand out, of course, was that lees aging. Most of their Albariños do have some amount of skin contact. So again, in your case, you did 12 months just of lees aging. Do you want to just touch for a minute why not do skin contact? What is it that you don't like about that?
Yeah, so I think we were about 14 months altogether.
14, yeah,
before we wrecked. But yeah, the skin contact, I mean, there's always, I know, there's a little bit of tannin, there's a little bit of phenolics or things that, you know, for the same reason that I don't skin contact my rosés. They crush and press pretty quick. I wanted structure, and the same thing that I look for in rosé. I want soft, fuller structure. I'm afraid of a sharper structure piece. So,
yeah.
And I don't have a must pump, so it would be kind of hard.
Oh, yeah.
So logistics, go that route. Logistics
come into play
for sure. Out. Yeah.
So I guess, and you sort of answered this a little bit. So I'm going to kind of throw this out to the group as well. So you can feel free to unmute yourselves or write into the chat if you want to. I have to make sure I can see the chat first. Here we go. Write into the chat if you want to. But my question here is that, okay, instead of kind of doing your normal quick turn, fresh, bright, fruity Albariño, this is going to go for 14 months on lees. So the first question is, what do we expect to be different? So this is a side-by-side experiment of, that early bottled one and this one that went 12 or 14 months on lees. So I'm going to put that out to the group and ask you all, either, like I said, by unmuting yourselves or writing into the chat, what is it that what's our preconceived notion of what's going to happen if we put something on lees for that long?
You get greater palate integration and affect the aromas, of course. Might also affect the aging potential.
Okay, so affect the aromas. So what would you expect for affecting the aromas?
You probably get less perception of acetate and ethyl esters. So it would be initially less fruity, but more complex.
Okay.
I say initially, it would cut down on the sort of fresh fruit character a little bit.
Yeah.
Not because it changes the production of those esters, but because you produce other things that sort of add to the panoply.
Yeah. So other folks, anything else? If you're kind of thinking about what would that look like in your cellar, what would you expect, or what would you expect to happen in that time? Anything else you're looking for? So with sort of as we move through, I did want to give just a little bit of background as to why we might expect some of those things to happen. So why we might be looking for a difference in the mouthfeel, why some of those esters might change. And that really has to do with of course, what's happening with the yeast lees themselves. So when we think about, when fermentation is done, and if you leave your wine on the lees, it's not like those yeast bodies just, automatically explode and put all of their guts into your wine so that everything happens all at once. In fact, it turns out that when your yeast don't die easily. They die in a very organized way and sometimes in a very slow way. So as conditions are getting worse for the cellular environment, so at the end of fermentation, when they're starting to starve, when stuff is running out, the yeast actually go through a very organized process called apoptosis. And part of that is they start to kind of sequester their degradative enzymes away into membrane-bound sacs. They start to sort of tuck things away, probably for two reasons. One of them might be that if conditions get better, they want their cells to be healthy enough that they can wake back up and start to ferment again. But also, if they die, there is this idea that part of apoptosis is to protect the rest of the population from them just sort of spewing their degradative enzymes out into the environment. And you might think, well, that sounds like altruism that microbes don't do. But you have to remember that in this case, most of the microbes in this population are all clones of each other. So it actually makes sense that there would be some selective pressure to keep them from killing the whole population at the same time. So again, those degradative enzymes go down into their membrane-bound particles, but eventually after they die, those membranes start to break down. And as those membranes start to break down, those degradative enzymes first just go back into the cytoplasm of the cell itself. So those degradative enzymes include proteases that are going to break down proteins. So those proteins get broken down into amino acids. They're going to include lipases that are going to start to break down the membranes themselves. And those sort of little lipid particles that get released from that can sometimes contribute to flavor as well. But probably more importantly, it makes it a little bit more likely that things will eventually leave that cell. And then we also have glucanases that together with the proteases start to break down the cell walls. And again, thinking about what has to happen for the good stuff to get out of that yeast cell into the wine, you have to get through some membranes and you have to get through the cell wall. But the other thing that's happening there is is that the cell wall itself is made up of proteins and carbohydrates, but that's where the manoproteins are found. So as these glucanases and proteases start to degrade your cell wall, that's when you start to release these manoproteins, which is a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about the good parts of yeast, of aging on yeast lees. And then eventually that cell wall sort of, it doesn't, again, it's not like it gets degraded so that it's not there anymore. It kind of gets degraded so there's enough pores there that things start to leave the cell. Those little bits that have been, the big polymers that have been chewed up into smaller bits, those bits start to leave the cell through the pores in the cell wall. So of course that leads to these sort of sensory impacts that Melanie and Bruce were talking about, that we think about happens when lees aging happens. So the first thing we think about there are of course the manoproteins. And when we think about manoproteins, these make up about 50% of our yeast cell walls, although the amount that's there is going to depend on the strain of yeast that you start with. And it's also going to depend on the conditions that the cell grew in, which is the condition of your fermentation. And most notably, the thing in the literature that they'll say about sort of getting more manoproteins, the less turbid the environment is, the more manoprotein you end up in your cell wall. So if you've got good clarified juice and you had that sort of slow fermentation, more likely to have more manoprotein. If you kind of have less clarified juice, or kind of a one of those really rapid ones where you've got all that stuff up in the environment, maybe not as much manoprotein. The manoproteins themselves are about 80% polysaccharide and about 20% protein. So even though they're manoproteins, they're mostly carbohydrate along the way. And that's what's going to give sort of this increased mouthfeel. Sometimes we get a sense of sweetness, and we have to remember polysaccharides are made up of little bits of sugar put together, so that can give us some sweetness. And again, sometimes there's some change in the finish along the way. One of the things that's changing the finish might be the interaction of our manoproteins with phenolics, so that it can reduce our perception of astringency and bitterness along the way. They also have some impact on the stability of the wine. So manoproteins can participate in basically blocking the growth of tartrate crystals. And if you kind of look at your Scott Labs catalog or your catalog from any of your suppliers, sometimes one of the things they'll try to sell in terms of stability or tartrate stability will be manoproteins. We'll see that has a limit to it, but it has that potential impact. Another potential impact is, again, sort of blocking proteins from sticking to each other, so that it will that will impact our protein stability. So protein stability, again, is when sort of our proteins get denatured a little bit, they stick together in a web, and that's when we start to see particles. So our manoproteins can come and kind of keep them from sticking to each other, so we can have greater protein stability if we have more manoproteins around. And then this one was really interesting to me. We oftentimes think about lees aging as having less fruity character to it. One of the things that our manoproteins can do is they can actually sort of block the absorption of our fruity esters by barrels. So again, in this case, Melanie was aging in tank, but if she was aging in barrels, we actually might see a little bit more retention of fruity character, because we won't lose quite as much of that to just simply adsorbing to the barrel. But then there's sort of, this all sounds pretty good. There is that one option, one thing though, that, leaving this long enough, eventually those polysaccharides are broken down, and we can eventually have some additional sugar that goes into the wine. And that sugar can be a source of nutrient for microbes. So we do have to kind of keep that in mind as well. Even if you start with a completely dry wine, this does release some sugars back in, and microbes like sugars. So, but the manoproteins aren't the only thing that are happening in the wine itself. So the cells are also filled with nitrogen-based compounds. We know we need to feed our cells nitrogen in order to get our cells to grow and reproduce. It turns out once they die, whatever amino acids are sort of floating around in their cell or their cytoplasm that hasn't been used yet, kind of passively is released back into the wine. That's not even really thought of as part of autolysis. That's just sort of a passive release based on a concentration gradient. But of course, as those proteases continue to work, more proteins get broken down, more amino acids are produced, and so there's more amino acid release into the wine over time. The good side of that is that they can be worked on by acid catalysis and other things in the wine to bring out, to actually form some flavor compounds. So for example, the sort of toasty nature in sparkling wine is thought to, at least in part, be due to some of those amino acids that are let go during autolysis. But of course, much like the sugar, this can also provide some nutrients for microbial spoilage. So that is something you have to keep in mind. And then the other thing that we'll talk about are just the volatiles themselves. So again, inside the cell, there are some esters and terpenes that are inside that cell that do get released out into the wine itself, so we can have a sort of a change in our fruity or floral aromatics. So those things kind of put together might lead to a little bit more complexity than what we had when we started. But when I was looking at kind of the background for this, the one thing that sort of struck me that I think we really need to say is that we need to remember that autolysis, this is a big, long process. It takes a long time for all of this to happen. So within the first couple of months, if you're just aging your wine on lees for 3 or 4 months before you barrel or before you bottle that Chardonnay, autolysis really doesn't get started until maybe 3 to at least 3-ish months. The literature goes somewhere between 2 and 9, depending on the conditions. But that autolytic character doesn't really start to happen until after about 3 months, even up to about 9 months. You still have kind of a lot of that is still in the process of happening. And so in order to kind of get that better mouthfeel, creaminess, that complexity, oftentimes that's somewhere between like 12 and 15 months in order to kind of really get the most out of that. So again, if we're aging our Chardonnay for 8 months before we bottle it, you'll get some of that, but you probably won't get all of it. So in this case, aging for 14 months really kind of started to maximize what was happening there. Now, the sparkling wine producers out there are thinking, but I aged my sparkling a lot longer than that. Under the conditions inside of the sparkling wine bottle, it can take a little bit longer for some of these processes to happen. So you may still have more to go once you get past 15 months if you're aging on lees and sparkling.
Well, there's not a lot of research published on this subject. There is a lot of variation among yeast species and strains, particularly in our case, strains of Saccharomyces, with regard to autolysis rate. And one of the reasons why there's not a lot of publication on that is because there's a lot of variables, that some of which you've alluded to, as to what's going to affect the rate. But I think that as these purveyors become more sophisticated, purveyors of yeast become more sophisticated, and maybe some of the sparkling wine producers actually loosen up a little bit and share more of their knowledge, we'll understand which strains are more rapidly autolyzed than others. Yeah.
And that's a good point, is that sort of that the source of your lees kind of matter in terms of how much you can really get from them. So Melanie, as we started this, there were some things to think about. So, what were you worried about? What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
That's a nice open-ended question.
This is already laughing because so much, right? Albariño is beautiful because it's bright and fresh and lovely and aromatic. And, was I gonna lose like part of the core of Albariño that I love so much? Was I going to end up with this nice wine, a lazy kind of fuller white that was just nondescript and you didn't know what it was? Was something bad going to happen? I mean, it was in a tank that I now feel pretty secure leaving something in for a long time, only because I've done it. So now I'll feel better to do it again. But going into this, there was a heavy sulfur addition after fermentation, but still, was there something in there? It was the cleanest fruit I've seen from the vineyard in 10 years, but you never know. You can't see all the little bad things that are in there. And, was something gonna take hold and start growing and doing something I really hated? And there was a time this tank was not temperature controlled. I didn't have a way to do that. And my temperature in that part of my cellar is not as well maintained as I wish it could be. Especially
right by the door, right?
In the summer. Yeah, and it's a really big space with some pretty poor airflow, which we're actually currently hopefully fixing, but so I can't really maintain the room temp where I wish I could. So we did see, through the summer, and that wine did warm up and started just kind of, I think now just off gassing because it was warming, but it felt like, was something going on. Like it seemed like it could have been active.
Yeah. So I'll throw that same question out to the audience. Is there anything else you would be worried about? So microbial spoilage, kind of loss of that character, anything else that you all would be?
One of the major advantages we have as a research in our research studies is we could add something like DMDC and make sure that we started off with fruit that didn't have any other microbes that would have an impact. We did do some work looking at NTUs and really what we're defining as primary and secondary leaves, which would obviously have an impact. We did some studies, not here in my lab, but on the West Coast using glucanases, which can make a big difference. Also,
Bruce, can I interrupt? Tell us a little bit about primary versus secondary leaves. What would not
generally
they are, but like why would that impact the wine differently?
Well, because you've got different compositions, primarily qualitative more than quantitative more than qualitative, but we generally, in a sort of pedestrian practitioner kind of sphere, define primary leaves as those that would drop out of the tank post-fermentation, of course, 24 hours post-fermentation, and therefore those would be discarded, and what came after would be considered secondary leaves. Although because these are not clinically defined terms, that means a little bit different things to different people. The point is that that's just another variable that would affect what you're doing, and what you end up with, as would, of course, total lees volume, stirring versus non-stirring, vessel type, timing of MLF, and all the other things that you can mention. That's why I kind of chuckled when you asked her about what she was concerned about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when we talk about this as winemakers, some of the things that come up with long lees aging is sort of, and you've kind of alluded to this, is, some people feel like if I'm on lees for a long time, that leesiness sometimes can be just outright reduction.
Yes.
And I think that that's one of those places where that difference between light lees and heavier lees really makes a difference in that.
Very much so.
If you're starting with really clean juice and you don't have a lot of like grape particles coming out that could be adding sulfur that gets really reductive, if you just sort of have those nice lees that are kind of still in the wine when you're racking off after a couple of days after fermentation, then you're more likely to have kind of that nice character. And then also just kind of the way to one of the ways to deal with that is by stirring. And so just, again, that redox potential that gets really, you can get more reduction in the bottom of the barrel and have, and that oxygen can kind of, stirring can even that out. But another thing that we hear sometimes is people are worried about oxidation. They're worried about getting, the wine gets tired, that acetaldehyde builds up, and even that you can feed acetobacter. And so in that case, you get to the idea of, yes, you want to be able to stir, but you also want to leave this in a very well topped vessel so that you don't have too much oxygen coming up at the top of it. And then, as Melanie was saying, unwanted microbial activity. So that could be acetobacter giving us giving us acetic acid, but that could also be malolactic fermentation, right? So Melanie, you didn't really want to go through mallow on these, but you're sitting here on lees that are going to kind of give you some nitrogen and they're going to give you some sugar. There's some microbes that could be happening in there. And so I think, Melanie, the way that you structured your experiment, you dealt with a lot of this in keeping it in a stainless steel tank, so you're not getting a lot of oxygen in. It was very well topped the whole time. And then you did have a good hit of SO2 at the beginning, which hopefully is going to be helpful, particularly against malolactic bacteria. So in this case, throughout aging, you were at a molecular SO2 that was above 0.6, and your total SO2 was like around 80. So those things are sort of helping. Unfortunately, you couldn't do the temperature piece of that, but you did try to stir. So tell us just a little bit about like what it was like to try to stir this.
Yeah, I wanted to stir, but I tried at first to maybe bubble real gently. Yeah, and I overflowed the tank. And then I tried even with just like a sparging stone at the bottom to go just really little, and it still was enough. Like it was full. Like there was no room. And to get a good stir, I'd have to pull wine out. I'm like, well, if I'm gonna pull some wine out of the tank, it's gonna get a big oxygen hit that I don't want it to get. So I really wasn't willing to do that. I was able to stir a little bit actually just by going to the top of the tank with my barrel stirrer and just kind of like really like working it. The tank is not huge. It's 850 liters. Don't think I could kick up the bottom of it, but from working it that way, you could you could see the wine from the top at the beginning and the end, and something got stirred up. Maybe not everything, but
you can. That's the nice thing with stirring lees, right? Is that like they sort of tell you when you started to take some leeway there. Yeah. So we've already kind of hit on most of this, but just sort of give us like the short version of actually how things got set up.
Yep. So everything came in from the vineyard. It was all the same lot, all pressed, whole clustered, juice, cold settled, racked, fermented, all is one big lot all together. So nothing different during fermentation. Fermentation, I just looked, was about 18 days. It was pretty cold. Right when I got to the end of it, and it was time to rack, I pulled off the small tank first and filled it up, and then I racked the rest of it into another big tank and just hit the little one with 100 parts of sulfur, and then my remainder was 65 parts, which is my standard after ferment.
And so the standard one was bottled in January of 2024, and then the long lees aged one was bottled in January of 2025. So we have that span of what's happening in the wines that you all tasted, so that what's in the glasses in front of you. We again have that sort of early bottling, really with no lees content, or versus the long aging that does have lees content. So you can take a look and see which is which. I will look at mine. Yeah, okay. Okay, and we'll get back to that in just a couple of minutes. I'll go ahead and tell you about the chemistry first, and then we can jump into talking about the sensory part of that. So again, as Melanie said, this was all fermented as one big lot, so there wasn't like a difference in, obviously not a difference in the juice or the wine, but we did want to show that, this did start with good sound fruit, good ripeness, plenty enough malolactic in there. The fermentation went smoothly, and when we look at the post-fermentation chemistry, again, we have a good sound wine going in there. The acetic acid is pretty low. No incidence of lactic or of malolactic bacteria or malolactic fermentation during the course of fermentation. And I forgot to put it on the slide here, but the glucose fructose was less than 1, which is the limit of detection of the test that we were using. So in this case, good sound wine going into that tank. So Melanie did a great job of kind of monitoring things as we sort of went through, especially sort of the spring and the summer. I will say that because some of these went to the ICV lab through WRE, some of those went to the local lab. So we do have a little bit of difference between the labs here. But when we look at the free sulfur, that December number is from before it got its big sulfur hit. But March, June, July, all kind of that initial big sulfur hit really held and kept that free sulfur in a position where we wouldn't have expected to see malolactic fermentation happening. Again, that total sulfur, it's only sort of in the instance for malolactic bacteria that total sulfur matters, but total sulfur does matter for malolactic bacteria. Again, good high number there if in order to prevent malo. pH was nice, it held. So again, if we were going to see malolactic, we would maybe think that this pH might start to drift a little bit, was holding really, really well. The TAs kind of shifted a little bit here and there, but again, that's probably more to do with the testing strategies themselves and the differences in those versus kind of real big differences. The malic acid, in December, it looked higher. The rest of the time it looked a little bit lower. So again, I'm not entirely sure why we had that higher number in December versus the lower numbers, except we did, these labs also gave us lactic acid numbers. And so when Melanie saw this number in March, and again in June, Melanie, you reached out to me. Do you remember what that was like?
Yeah, I know. I'm sure it was at one of my panic calls. Like I didn't want this going through ML, so I was really worried because, like, again, at the time it was warmer in the cellar, so it had more of an opportunity, and it was looking a little fizzy and cloudy when it was more clear before. So it really seemed like maybe something was going on.
Yeah, so we saw these numbers actually when I came up to Northern Virginia in the summer. We tasted them together, and we're like, it doesn't really taste like it's going through Malo, but these numbers are there. And then, so we sent another sample then, that it was that June sample that I ended up coming and tasting with you. In July, we sent another sample and it looks quite low. So what it ends up looking like here is that really probably those numbers in March and June were aberrant, maybe a calibration thing on the instrument, whereas that July number, and then the May number is what the lab showed on the bottled wine. So in this case, it looks like it really didn't go through Malo. But that was one of those instances where it's like, we need to taste it. We need to send a check sample to make sure that this isn't more than we think that it is.
How are these measured?
Huh?
How are these measured?
They're both FTIRs.
Oh, okay. Well, you got to expect a little slack.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's the thing, is just understanding what's the sort of, what is, how they're being measured and what we can expect in terms of some range there. But the other thing I would also say is that, another thing we might be worried about is acetic acid accumulation. In this case, we didn't see any of that. So Melanie, you did a great job of keeping this good and protected as it was sitting on lees for that amount of time. So one of the other things that we did say earlier on is that long lees aging, the release of these nanoproteins might impact our cold stability or our heat stability. In this case, it did not impact the cold stability. Both of these were unstable at both early and pre-cold stabilization, both early and late. But we did see a little bit of a shift in the protein stability. So in this case, when we sent this for a bentonite trial, if for those of you that aren't used to looking at these, any change in NTU less than 2 is considered to be stable. So in this case, if we look at the early bottled wine prior to bottling, it basically doesn't get to be protein stable until it's at about 0.6 grams per liter. I did calculate this for the folks in there. If you think in pounds per 1,000 gallons, that's 5 pounds per 1,000 gallons. If we look at the long aging wine, again, a whole year later after it had aged on lees, it looks like it gets stable at about 0.2 grams per liter, or that is 1.7 pounds per 1,000 gallons, if you think in those terms. So in this case, we do see some shifting that in the protein stability. And again, that could be because of interactions with nanoproteins. It could just be that some of those unstable proteins are unstable and they eventually came out during aging. But either way, that is one sort of, I guess, benefit along the way. Here we go. And then I did want to just go ahead and show you the chemistry of the wines that you actually tasted. So the wines that you tasted are bottled wines. But again, what we can see is that, the main chemistry of this is very much the same. There's a little bit of difference, obviously, in the free sulfur, but it got less to begin with. And the early bottling one has been in bottle for longer. So it's not unheard of that we would see a lower level there. So that's kind of what we have for the chemistry. This is pretty straightforward that way. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. See if I can figure out how to do this. Stop presenting. There we go. And I'll ask you, if you're able, if you can go ahead and sort of put your cameras on. I'd love to sort of hear about what you all thought about the sensory characteristics of the wines here. So it's going to take me a minute. So I'm going to ask you just to sort of vote by raising your hand. Raise your hand if you were able to tell the difference between the wines. I can't necessarily see all of this. All right. Okay, so I do see lots of hands going up. Oh, there we go. There's the hands. Thank you. Okay, so for those of you that were able to tell the difference between the wines, what was different about them. So you can, if you're able, we'd love to have you unmute yourself and kind of talk into the group. If you're not able to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and go into the chat, and we can talk about it that way. And again, if you're able to put on your camera and we can see you, that would be even better. So what was different about the wines? Let's see. I'm gonna start calling on people.
Well, I mean, for me, it was kind of, I got more apricot notes out of the short aged one, which kind of got me thinking it might have been the long aged one. So I got surprised a little bit. There was much more elegance to the long aged these wines, but it also had a freshness to it, which was really interesting. It kind of threw me off a little bit because it was very fresh, but it was very complex at the same time. And I was thinking I liked the one that was short age, but it ended up being the one that was longer age. So.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad that that there is still sort of had that freshness to it, because Melanie, that was one of the things that you were concerned about, is that it might lose some of that freshness. So in that sense too, the that reductive nature, like these are reductive, and in that sense they can help to protect against oxidation to some degree, I would think. So so Kirsty thought that the early bottled had brighter aromas and a good amount of texture. So in that case, just sort of that brightness to the early bottled wine.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree.
Me too.
Other differences.
Which I think that's what I thought the early one had more texture too, which was, I mean, I just could have sworn it was going to be the one that had been on the lees for a year. So it was surprising to me.
Okay. I felt like there was a big difference for me in kind of the perception of acidity at the end. To me, the early bottled wine had like that zingy acidity at the end. And the long aged one, it still had freshness to it, but it wasn't it didn't kind of have that zing. I don't know if it's not really a good technical term, but other differences. Anything else in the difference between the wines? Okay. Melanie, what did you think? Did you taste it blind, or did you not do the blind? You did do the blind. Were you able to tell the difference?
I was, and I almost thought I wasn't going to. I was having a little bit of trouble, and I had to rush home because our service, the winery, was really sketchy, and I need to get here on time. So I kind of rushed through everything, and I think that was part of it. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm not even going to get this. And I did get it. But I thought the early one may have been the aged one. So I need to kind of sit and spend more time with that aged bottle to really get a better idea of what I think about it. But I might give it some more time too. It's bottled in January. It's probably just about there. We do plan on releasing it in the fall, so we just have a little bit more time if it needs it. Yeah, there was something. I mean, the early one to me was a little bit softer, and there was actually something on the aged one that was actually felt a little bit sharp this time to me that I didn't appreciate. So I definitely need to spend some more time with it. Admittedly, they were all too warm too, definitely warmer than they're ever going to be served at. So.
Yeah, and that is something like for sensory, we serve them at room temperature so that we don't have differences, because it's easier to control it. But the temperature that you consume the beverage is going to impact the aromatics and the perception of acidity and the mouthfeel along the way, for sure. For sure. I'm not sure if I can do this because I can't see everybody. Actually, if you still have your hand raised, if you can unraise your hand a minute. Because some of you have your I would be interested to know what the preferences were. We did have one sort of pop up here. Tim says he thought that the aged seemed cleaner and rounder, and I thought possibly this was an Arabinol addition. Okay, yeah. So that roundness, I think, sort of gives you that gives you kind of that a similar affect maybe than if you kind of Like arabinol is that that's a carbohydrate, right? I haven't used it. Bruce, what is arabinol?
I'm sorry.
Tim
that-
mentioned that it seemed like an arabinol addition. I haven't used arabinol. What is arabinol? I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot too. Probably still an addition just to increase mouthfeel. So
Oh, a Rabinol. Yeah, it's a sugar
Okay, yeah.
based product. I
Okay.
didn't know if you're talking to me.
oh, sorry.
And like I say, I'm struggling from having spent the night on the plane.
That's fine.
Yeah, it's supposed to add roundness.
Okay.
I think
Yeah. so
there's
it's
a couple of products out there that have it in it.
Okay. Yeah. So in that case, we would be targeting a similar mechanism there of kind of that polysaccharide
Right.
mouthfeel increase. Okay. Okay. So I would love to see preferences. So who preferred the early bottling wine? And in this case, if you can use the little like raise your hand thing at the bottom of the screen there so that we can sort of, hopefully, I think I can see all of them if that happens. Maybe. Here we go. Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so these folks are okay. So then, so if you've got your hand raised, it looks like you have maybe like 9 or 10, 9. So go ahead and lower your hands for those of you that just raised them. Who preferred the long aged wine? Go ahead and raise your hand so that way we get a count. Any other votes coming in? And I'm still getting used to Google Meet. I can't really see everybody at one time. So it looks like we don't have as many people that preferred the second wine. So one of the folks that preferred the second wine, tell me what you preferred about it. The long age wine. I think Todd, your hand looks like it's up there. What did you prefer about the longer age wine?
Yeah, like I said earlier, I think there was a complexity to it, but it was still very fresh and very bright. I kind of thought, and this is why, like Melanie, I almost had them confused in my head. I knew I liked this wine better, but I thought it was the other one because my sample 346 it just felt like it had lower acid on it and more texture. So I thought, yeah, this is definitely the one that's been on the lees for the extra year. But I liked the other one better. I liked it because it was there was a complexity there. It was bright and fresh without being over the top in terms of acidic, and that's just kind of a wine that I like. I thought the one that was bottled short was maybe a little too apricot-y, almost like a little stewed apricot or stewed stone fruit, and I wasn't really digging that. So there was just I like that wine because it was brighter and more complex to me.
Okay, so how about somebody who preferred the early bottling wine? There were lots of folks that raised hand for that. Tell us what you liked about the early bottling wine.
I enjoyed the fruitiness and the freshness of it.
Okay. Yeah, so that seems like a style thing, right? Like what are we looking for in a white wine? Are we looking for that bright fruit and that bright freshness, or that sort of bigger complexity and more texture along the way? So other things that people preferred about the first wine.
I thought your comment of perception of acidity, that I would agree with that. And I thought for that wine, given how big the volume was, it was well balanced with the acidity.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So I like that comment that it sort of balances with the volume of the wine, because Albariño, it was over 13% alcohol. It is kind of one of the bigger whites, but it sort of still had that freshness to it. So, yeah. Kirsty asks, are you selling these two wines under different labels or names and at different price points?
Yes. So the early one is, standard practice for us. So our standard bottling. The long aging one will be a reserve for us. So it was bottled in in a fancier bottle with a cork closure instead of a screw cap, and it will be a higher price point.
And I have them here. So this is sort of the normal bottling. I don't know how to focus there, but you can see normal bottle. And then this one is more in that kind of different shaped bottle. And again, yeah, the cork versus the screw cap on those. So they look very different if they're sitting on the shelf as well. And one of the reasons you mentioned that it hasn't been released yet, one of the reasons we sort of saved this one to do later in the year as, in May as a white wine was really because it was bottled in January, and we wanted to give it a little bit of time. So, so hopefully it's ready for you when you release it in the fall that way. So.
Yep.
Any other thoughts, comments, or questions about this experiment? I'm going to ask Melanie what you think. This was kind of an investment of time and effort for you. Is this the kind of thing that do you feel like you got enough of a difference in these two wines that you would want to do this again? Is this what you wanted to see in the wine? What are your thoughts about this long lees aging?
I don't think I'm decided yet, especially after like my tasting just now, right? I want to say yes. We'll see. I mean, the nice thing is that it went into this little tank. It didn't have to go in barrel. I won't be as scared to do it again because I was able to keep it so safe. If I do it again, I'll wait for another great year though. I kind of got lucky that when I wanted to do this, ended up being the best I've ever seen that fruit. So if I see it come in like that again, there's a good chance I will. The really great thing is that I don't have to decide until the tail end of fermentation, right? So I can as long as that little tank is open, I can pull and do that later. Yeah, I'm going to taste this again. We'll probably release in September or October. So I will be checking in with this again to make my final decision if I liked what it did and I did what I hoped it did.
Well, and I mean, the nice thing there too is that you get your customers can vote a little bit too with their purchases, right? You can get customer feedback to see if this is a style that they appreciate and that they are interested in seeing more of.
Yeah, sure.
So, and if you ever want to try skin contact, we can talk. I know that's not your cup of tea.
You mentioned concern about oxidation with regard to stirring. We did a trial on the West Coast along those lines, not with this grape, but with a producer that did some pretty aggressive stirring. And so they wanted to set up so that they could differentiate the oxidative changes from the changes that were outlined with regard to autolysis and whatnot. So we added ascorbic acid, which is something that I tried for years to get our producers here in Virginia to at least consider. The scary thing about ascorbic acid is that it can add as a very potent antioxidant, but it can also add, if not used properly, to be a pro-oxidant. So you have to have the ratio of ascorbic to SO2 well under control. But it makes some sense if you want to differentiate in this case, the lees activity versus just straight oxidation that would occur when you're barreling or stirring. So that trial is still going on, but we used ascorbic acid and kept the SO2 level up enough to prevent the ascorbic from becoming a proto-oxidant. But I would just suggest that if there are any Virginia producers interested in ascorbic, and I think there should be some, if your concern is oxidative degradation, then you can look on my enology notes or other sources to find out the wit and wisdom of ascorbic acid. Yeah. It does strike me as interesting that years and years and years ago, when I went over to Australia, I found that most of the producers there were using it. And I come back and suggest it to people here both in Virginia and the West Coast. And I got the no way, Jose, because if one or two people have used it, didn't quite use it properly. And of course, bad news travels pretty rapidly and causes certain perception. But it's a viable and valuable tool.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I would say that if folks are interested in ascorbic acid, as Bruce said, his enology notes are still a tremendous resource online. And if you do want some help wading through that, I'm happy to be a bridge between those two things as well. So Drew asked a question, Melanie, do you know which clone of Albariño this was from? Because is this fruit that you grow, or is this fruit that comes from another vineyard?
It is not. So this is from Dean Triplett at Greenstone Vineyard, who's not far from me. I don't grow it. He would definitely know that answer. I can tell you that he's purchased all the vines from AA, and I think they only had one option. So if we looked at their catalog, we might be able to answer that question.
Great. Are there any other questions before we wrap it up today? As we get ready to sign off, I will say once again, many, many thanks to Melanie for doing the experiment and just letting me taste with you as we went through all of this. It was really interesting to see what that intervention is going to do with the wines. We also want to make sure to thank the Virginia Wine Board that funds the research exchange. We have received funding for next year again. And so you know what I'm going to say is that it's time that I'm going to start coming around and talking to you about experiments for next year. We do have kind of a robust running list of things that have come up during the course of our sensory sessions this year. But if there is something that you've heard about or read about, or that's come up for discussion in discussions that you've had that you would like to do as an experiment, just please consider this to be an open invitation. We would love to include your winery in our experimental programming for next year. If you do have something you're interested in, please just feel free to contact me. You can either stay on the call today, you can email me or text me or whatever, and we can start talking about experiments for next year. So with that, I will thank you all so much for your participation by filling out your sensory session or your sensory sheets, for your comments today and throughout the whole year. We wouldn't be able to do this without folks that are willing to do experiments and folks that are willing to come and give us the sensory data and really give us these great questions to help us to understand the experiments better. So thank you so much for that. I will go ahead and sign off for now. But like I said, if you'd like to chat for a little bit, I'll stay on the call for a little bit as well. So thank you guys.
Thank you, ladies.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce.